What I want to do, just briefly in the course of the next 10 minutes, is talk about four things, really. First of all, just give you a summary of what localism seems to be, as I see it. Secondly, talk about some of the challenges which I think we face in supporting the vulnerable. Thirdly, perhaps a slightly harder bit for me to put together, was around the opportunities, but there certainly are some opportunities out there, again, in supporting the vulnerable. And lastly, just try and give a few practical tips from my experience as a councillor for people engaging with local authorities, as I'm sure very many of you do, and see if those are of any use. And I look forward very much to hearing people's perspectives in discussion and in questions. So what is localism? Eric Pickles defined localism thus. He said, "It is a groundbreaking shift in power to councils and communities, overturning decades of central government control and starting a new era of people power." Which is very exciting indeed. People may remember that for a while from the Department for Communities and Local Government, as it then was, there was talk about new localism, and that was associated with some ideas about double devolution, passing power from town halls to citizens and so on. We seem now to be back just with talk about localism. For my purposes this morning, what I'm talking about really is developments in policy towards local government and I suppose local communities since May 2010, rather than going for any more reified academic definition than that. I think there are sort of four areas I'd mention. The first is on housing. Clearly we're seeing significant changes to homelessness legislation at the moment. We're seeing the rollout of the affordable rent model, moving rents up to 80% of market rents. There's going to be some local authority control over that, but that being said, we've, I think, been quite clearly told as local authorities that if we're getting funding from the HCA, then in most circumstances we're expected to play the affordable rent game, and clearly as local authorities as well, our ability to prevent registered providers churning their stock and banging up some of the rents when there are vacancies, when there are voids to the affordable rent level is limited. There's also going to be new local discretion over security of new tenancies, as people will be aware, potentially as short as 2 years, it may be longer than that. Some councils, certainly my authority for example, will be sticking with security of tenure and won't be looking to change that. Thirdly, people will be aware that there's going to be changes in the way that local authorities are able to discharge their duties to those who are accepted as being in priority need and homeless, unintentionally homeless, and there'll be a possibility of duty discharge into the private rented sector. It's a controversial area. I must admit that I think that actually homelessness prevention, statutory homelessness prevention, has been going in that direction for some time, and it may not be quite as momentous as is being suggested. There's been a reform of council house finance, which may or may not be on people's radar, and local authorities are working now on their long-term business plans. Essentially, the local authorities will be able to keep their council house rents if they've retained a housing stock in return for getting a one-off allocation of historic housing debt from the government. So rather than paying money back to central government from council house rents, they'll have to pay interest and repayments on an allocation of debt from the government. The exciting bit, I think, for people in this room is that there is going to be a chance now to shape developments in local authorities' business plans for their housing stocks. If you've got views, for example, on the sort of stock that ought to be developed or on the services that are provided to residents where the local authority has retained its stock, now is a very good time to get involved. Thirdly, on housing, we're clearly seeing the housing benefit cuts kicking in, and as local authorities, we have to administer those, so actually our discretion is extremely limited. And as a local government group, we've been lobbying hard for changes on a whole range of areas, I have to say without a great deal of success. I want to mention planning because I think I'm conscious that in the area of housing supply, closely related to the planning process, sits at the root of very many of the problems that we face. The government has got rid of regional assemblies and regional planning and instead wants to see a greater emphasis on the level below local authorities. It talks about neighbourhoods. So there won't be any more regional targets or coordination. Instead, there's a loose duty to cooperate between local authorities, for example, to secure relevant infrastructure. Local authorities will, though, still need to meet their housing need, which they identify. There won't be a common methodology for doing that. And one of my concerns, on a personal note, is that some local authorities will seek to downplay need in order to reduce the number of homes that they have to build. But ultimately, they will need to justify before a planning inspector that they're going to build the homes they need. And in addition to that, neighbourhoods should not be able to opt out or obstruct much-needed new homes. However, local authorities will need to engage with so-called neighbourhoods. say they can't opt out of strategic plans. One thing on neighbourhoods, and I'll just pause here because I think it's relevant and quite important, is what is a neighbourhood and who is a neighbourhood. It seems to me that what we can't have is a situation where the only people engaging with the planning process are owner-occupiers in villages, perhaps with their own resident barrister getting stuck into the process. We need to think about future occupants in an area, and we need to think about all sections of the community, including those in housing need. The government's introducing a new incentive scheme for local authorities to see homes built called the New Homes Bonus, which will give people money for each, essentially for each occupied, completed new unit, minus those which have been demolished. And there's also going to be a change to planning for something called Community Infrastructure Levy, replacing Section 106 agreements, which have been the main way of funding related infrastructure to new housing developments so far. Again, there's a question here, I suppose, with these rewards for growth, which is who gets rewarded. There's a lot of talk about compensating people who are affected in some way by new development. I think that's fine, but one problem is you might end up rewarding those who already, for example, are owner-occupiers, nice houses, nice view, don't much like new houses, so you give them a bit of a bung to keep them quiet. What instead you need to be doing, I think, is looking at the whole of the community, and I think that's perhaps an angle which people in this room may help local authorities develop. Local authorities are apparently going to get a power of competence, so there'll be fewer legal restrictions on what we can do, though there are some, we've had quite a few exemptions to that. There's an encouragement for community groups to take on public services, a so-called community right to challenge. That being said, community groups can knock at the door and say, I want to challenge this service, we're interested in taking it on. There's no right then to, or no guarantee that the challengers will take off on the service. And one of, I think, our concerns is that you may get well-intentioned third sector groups knocking at the door, challenging a service, and then the private sector will come barging through the door in a competitive bidding process. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful what we wish for in that regard. The local authorities will be required to maintain community asset registers, but we're not going to be forced to dispose of assets at a sub-market level. Clearly, there's a whole range of changes which we could talk about with regards to health service and the public health role. As local authorities, we welcome the fact that the public health role is shifting towards us. And then lastly, there's a sort of bonfire of the targets going on, an ending of comprehensive area assessment and a scaling down of the inspection regime. So those are some of the other developments. Lastly, just a few things on the financial front. We're seeing the localisation, and details should emerge soon, of council tax benefit. Some would say that's surprising in the light of the introduction of universal credits. So on the one hand, we're moving towards a system which is meant to be simpler. On the other hand, potentially you'll have 375 different variations on the scheme of council tax benefit. There's an unwritten fencing of various grants, such as supporting people and homelessness prevention. So local authorities will no longer be required to spend those on particular services. We are about to see details of a local government finance reform, which again will reward local authorities for seeing growth in business rates in their area. So essentially, if you track new businesses, you will get some of the reward from that, whereas the current system means all income from that is pooled nationally. And lastly, and I think most obviously, we're seeing unprecedented funding cuts to local government, 12%, I say next year, I mean this year really, this current financial year, and 28% in government grant over the next 4 years, in spite of the cost pressures that local authorities face, clearly with, for example, utility costs being something which affects us profoundly. So in terms of the challenges, I mean, first of all, I think, this is something which really troubles me. We need to make sure that the vulnerable are not unduly affected or disproportionately affected by funding cuts. I think that's hard, given that the vulnerable are disproportionately likely to rely on public services. Unring fencing, which is something the local government group welcomes, I think poses a particular challenge because it may well be that local authorities look to divert resources, for example, from supporting people, where it's a direct service for the vulnerable, but potentially people who may not be very politically vocal or active, towards other services which have a higher profile in the community. So that's something I think to be watchful for. We have, as I alluded to, relatively little power as local authorities over registered providers in our areas, for example, over rents and tenancies, and I see that as a challenge. I think there are huge risks, well, not just risks, I think there are huge problems with housing benefit cuts and other benefit cuts. And I would emphasise here that there's almost no local discretion, and certainly in our local authority we try to be really clear with people who are seeing their benefits cut that this isn't something of our making, while at the same time lobbying, the local government group has also been lobbying for improvements. There's going to be huge challenges in delivering the universal credit to the vulnerable as well. We understand as the local government group that the Department for Work and Pensions Job Centre Plus will be people's main interface, and by and large the main service will be delivered over the telephone. Now currently as local authorities we provide by and large personal assistance to a lot of vulnerable people in person in our offices, and that will come to an end. And so there are sort of, I think, big questions about how the rollout of universal credit will affect the vulnerable and what sort of service will be provided. There are some quite optimistic prognoses about the number of claimants, for example, who will be submitting claims online. I think the ending of targets, which is something the local government group welcomes, is good as far as it goes. But again, sometimes targets have been set for good reasons, which is to focus local authority interests on the interests of the vulnerable, interests which may not always be reflected through sort of public debates in the political process. And so one good question people in this room may well want to ask local authorities is, what are you doing to monitor some of the targets which previously existed around securing social inclusion and avoiding people becoming marginalised? And then lastly, you've seen this emphasis on growth, which the government places, which in many ways is welcome. But I think we just need to worry a little bit about a race to the bottom. Clearly, it's not completely within local authorities' gift, for example, whether you see business rate growth in our areas. In addition to that, if you localise council tax benefit, then there are potentially worries about authorities gaining financially from cutting benefits. So that's a worry. In terms of opportunities, in housing and planning, I mean, there's an opportunity for us to steer the debate on growth and put good arguments. There's an opportunity, I suppose, for us to tailor local strategies more neatly to meet local housing needs. There's definitely an opportunity around reform of the housing revenue accounts and the way local authorities shape their own housing services. And there's a need, I think, to ensure, as I've said, that the vulnerable don't get left out. There may well be opportunities around sharing services, for example, between local authorities and the DWP, community and voluntary sector and local authorities. The public health role should be, I think, regarded as an opportunity rather than just a problem, and I'm sure people in this room will be in touch with their local authorities about that. There's talk now about moving towards some place-based budgeting on homelessness. It's embryonic, but I know that's something ministers are interested in. It may be a colleague from CLG will be able to fill us in a little bit more on that. And of course, there are also some ideas knocking around about new forms of social investment finance. So, lastly, I just wanted to conclude for the last 30 seconds with a couple of practical sort of tips. I mean, one is that I think we need to keep our minds very focused on steering the debate on growth, trying to make sure that growth serves all sections of our community, and in particular trying to keep the vulnerable at the forefront of our minds. Secondly, it seems to me in this area of localism, winning over elected members and local communities is probably more important than ever before. So just a few thoughts on that. I mean, one is that it seems to me personal contact is better than just a round-robin email. As a councillor, you get hundreds of emails inviting you to conferences, information on an unsolicited basis. I wonder how often people have picked up the phone and spoken or suggested having a meeting with interested members of their local authorities. Have you considered approaching local authorities for a member champion for particular groups, such as the homeless? That might be worth doing. Might be worth suggesting to some of your colleagues in your organisations that they want to go and address a council meeting, or maybe even suggest to the secretary of the controlling group, if there is one on the council, would you like us to come to your group meeting and just do a 10-minute presentation about our work? I think anything which can raise the profile of the work done by people in this room is a resoundingly good thing. And then lastly, if you offer a sort of tea and biscuit style reception in a town hall on a Tuesday, you won't necessarily get the councillors who in the end are going to be driving decisions, or indeed the senior council officers. So you need to do a little bit of work identifying who the real movers and shakers politically at an officer level in local authorities are, and then push your case really, really hard. So, lastly, on behalf not just of me, but of the entire local government group, thank you for everything you're doing and the very best of luck.